The evidence room at the Fremont County Sheriff's Office smelled of dust and forgotten time, boxes stacked floor to ceiling like monuments to unsolved grief. Detective Amanda Walsh pulled on latex gloves as she approached box number 1990-127. Its cardboard corners soft with age and bearing the faded signature of a long-retired investigator. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of cold cases that had been waiting decades for this moment. Inside the box lay a plastic evidence bag containing a burgundy wool jacket, its fabric still holding the ghost of a young woman's last day. Sarah Crowfeather's jacket. Walsh had requested this specific piece of evidence after receiving notification that the Wyoming State Crime Lab had finally acquired the advanced STR DNA analysis equipment that could extract profiles from samples previously considered too degraded to process. The technology that might have saved Sarah's family 34 years of anguish simply hadn't existed in 1990. Walsh carefully lifted the jacket, feeling its weight in her hands. A single dark hair clung to the collar, so fine it was almost invisible, except under the evidence room's unforgiving light. This hair had been noted in the original report, but never tested. Detective Robert Fraser, who had worked the case until his retirement in 2003, had mentioned it in his notes with the frustration of a man who knew evidence was slipping through his fingers. Back then, DNA testing required blood or semen samples, and even those weren't always reliable. The detective's phone buzzed against the metal table. The crime lab had confirmed what Walsh hoped for and dreaded in equal measure. The hair contained enough intact genetic material for analysis. After 3 decades of silence, Sarah Crowfeather might finally have her voice back. Walsh had taken over this cold case unit 6 months ago, inheriting boxes like these that represented not just unsolved crimes, but shattered families who had never stopped believing that someone, somewhere, still cared enough to seek the truth. Sarah's case had immediately drawn her attention, not just because of the brutality of what had happened to a 19-year-old college student, but because of the jurisdictional chaos that had contaminated the original investigation from day one. The Wind River Reservation straddled county lines and federal boundaries, creating a legal maze that had allowed crucial evidence to sit unprocessed while investigators argued over who had authority to pursue which leads. Sarah had been found on tribal land, but the last place she'd been seen alive was in the border town of Riverton, complicating everything from witness interviews to evidence collection. By the time the various agencies had sorted out their jurisdictions, the trail had gone cold, and Sarah's killer had vanished into the Wyoming wilderness. Now, as Walsh sealed the evidence bag and filled out the chain of custody forms, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with reopening old wounds. She thought of Michael Crowfeather, Sarah's younger brother, who called the sheriff's office every year on the anniversary of his sister's death. His voice had grown hoarse with age and disappointment, but he never stopped asking the same question. Had anyone found anything new? December 15th, 1990. Snow fell across the Wind River Reservation in thick, silent curtains that muffled sound and erased footprints within hours. Sarah Crowfeather pulled her burgundy wool jacket tight against the bitter cold as she stepped out of her grandmother's small house on Ethiet Road. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow that barely penetrated the swirling darkness, and her breath formed small clouds that disappeared into the night. Her grandmother Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Sarah walked toward her rusted Chevy pickup truck. The old woman would later tell investigators that something had felt wrong about that evening, a heaviness in the air that made her want to call Sarah back inside. But 19-year-old girls don't listen to grandmothers' intuitions about danger, especially when they're late for a date with possibility. Sarah had driven the 40-minute route from the reservation to Riverton countless times, usually to visit friends or attend community college classes. That night, she'd told Eleanor she was meeting someone at the truck stop cafe on Federal Boulevard, though she'd been vague about who. Eleanor had pressed for details, but Sarah had simply smiled and said it was someone who might have information about a summer job in Casper. With graduation approaching, Sarah was desperate to find work that would help her escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped so many of her friends. The Riverton truck stop sat at the intersection of two highways, a beacon of neon and diesel fumes that never slept. Waitress Linda Hoffman was working the late shift that December night, serving coffee to long-haul truckers and the occasional local brave enough to venture out in the storm. She remembered Sarah because the young woman had seemed nervous, constantly checking the door and barely touching the coffee she'd ordered. Sarah had sat in booth 7, the one facing the parking lot, for nearly 2 hours. Around 11:30, Linda noticed Sarah suddenly straighten up, as if she'd seen someone she recognized. The young woman left $1 on the table and walked out into the blizzard without saying a word. Through the frost-covered windows, Linda caught a glimpse of Sarah approaching a dark vehicle parked near the edge of the lot. But the snow was too heavy to make out details of the car or its occupant. That was the last time anyone saw Sarah Crowfeather alive. When she failed to return home by morning, Eleanor called the tribal police. Officer James Murphy drove out to check the roads, assuming Sarah had slid into a ditch somewhere along the treacherous route home. The blizzard had dumped 8 inches of snow overnight, making travel nearly impossible and erasing any tire tracks that might have told a story. For 3 days, search teams combed the highways and back roads between Riverton and Ethiet. Volunteers from the reservation joined county deputies and even some off-duty state troopers in a grid search that expanded wider each day. They found Sarah's truck first, abandoned in a ravine 12 miles south of the truck stop, its keys missing and interior covered with a thin layer of snow from the broken passenger window. Sarah herself was discovered on the 3rd day by a rancher checking his cattle. She lay beneath a stand of cottonwood trees near Crowheart Butte, her body partially covered by snow and debris. The scene made no sense to the first responders who arrived. Sarah was fully clothed, her burgundy jacket zipped up against the cold, but she was lying on her back in an almost peaceful position, as if she had simply laid down to rest and never woken up. The jurisdictional nightmare began within hours of finding Sarah's body. Crowheart Butte sat on the edge of 3 different law enforcement territories, and as investigators arrived at the scene, the confusion became immediately apparent. Tribal police officer James Murphy had been first to respond, but the location technically fell under Fremont County Sheriff's jurisdiction. When the FBI arrived, claiming federal authority due to Sarah's status as a Native American woman potentially killed on tribal land, the crime scene had already been compromised by well-meaning but uncoordinated efforts. Detective Robert Fraser from the Fremont County Sheriff's Office found himself caught in a bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to obstruct justice rather than serve it. The FBI agents, fresh from Quantico and unfamiliar with reservation politics, treated the local officers like obstacles to be managed rather than allies with intimate knowledge of the community. Meanwhile, the tribal police felt pushed aside by federal investigators who showed little understanding of cultural sensitivities or the deep mistrust many Native families harbored toward outside law enforcement. The evidence collection suffered immediately. Sarah's body had been photographed and documented by 3 different agencies, each following their own protocols, and none sharing information efficiently with the others. The burgundy jacket that would later prove crucial was logged into the county's evidence system, but samples for testing were sent to 3 different labs, causing delays and confusion about chain of custody. The single hair on the collar was noted by the county's crime scene technician, but somehow never made it to the FBI's initial evidence list. Fraser spent the first week of the investigation trying to coordinate between agencies that seemed more interested in protecting their turf than catching Sarah's killer. Phone calls went unreturned, witness interview schedules conflicted, and crucial forensic evidence sat in bureaucratic limbo while agencies debated who had primary jurisdiction. The detective's frustration mounted as he watched potential leads grow cold in the December freeze. The truck stop where Sarah was last seen alive became another point of contention. The cafe sat just outside tribal boundaries, placing it firmly in county jurisdiction. But the FBI insisted on interviewing witnesses themselves. Waitress Linda Hoffman ended up being questioned 4 separate times by different investigators, each asking slightly different questions and none apparently sharing their notes with the others. By her 4th interview, Linda's memory had become muddied by the repetition, and she began second-guessing details she'd been certain about initially. The most damaging confusion involved the dark vehicle Linda had glimpsed in the parking lot. The FBI's initial report described it as a sedan, while the county's witness statement called it a pickup truck. The tribal police, who had conducted their own informal canvass of the area, heard rumors about a van with out-of-state plates, but this information never made it into any official report. 3 weeks into the investigation, the agencies finally held a coordination meeting, but by then, the trail of the mysterious vehicle had gone completely cold. Fraser's personal notes from that period, discovered years later in his desk after retirement, revealed his growing desperation. He wrote extensively about leads that weren't being followed, evidence that wasn't being processed, and witnesses who were falling through the cracks of interagency communication. One entry, dated January 3, 1991, simply read, "This girl deserves better than what we're giving her." The media attention that might have kept pressure on the investigation was minimal. Sarah's disappearance had briefly made local news, but the resolution felt anticlimactic to reporters who had expected a missing person case, not a jurisdictional dispute over a murder investigation. The Casper Star-Tribune ran a single follow-up story about the ongoing investigation, but by February, other news had captured public attention, and Sarah Crowfeather's name disappeared from the headlines. Michael Crowfeather was 17 when his sister died, a junior in high school who had looked up to Sarah as both sibling and surrogate parent after their mother's death from diabetes complications 3 years earlier. The night Sarah didn't come home, Michael had waited in the kitchen with his grandmother Eleanor, watching the clock tick past midnight and fighting the growing certainty that something terrible had happened. When Officer Murphy arrived at dawn with news that they'd found Sarah's truck, Michael felt his childhood end in that moment, replaced by a responsibility he'd never asked for and would carry for the next 34 years. The funeral arrangements became the first of many battles Michael would fight on his sister's behalf. The FBI requested that Sarah's burial be delayed pending further forensic examination, but Eleanor insisted on traditional Arapaho customs that required prompt burial to help Sarah's spirit find peace. The compromise reached after tense negotiations allowed for a traditional wake followed by burial, but the family felt pressured and disrespected throughout the process. Michael watched his grandmother age years in those few days, her grief compounded by the feeling that even in death, outsiders were controlling decisions about her granddaughter. As the investigation stalled through 1991, Michael appointed himself the family's liaison with law enforcement, calling Detective Fraser weekly for updates that became increasingly disappointing. Fraser, to his credit, always took Michael's calls and never dismissed his questions, but the young man could hear the frustration in the detective's voice as leads dried up and bureaucratic obstacles multiplied. Michael began keeping his own files, copying every police report the family was allowed to see, and maintaining a timeline of the investigation that grew more detailed than some official records. His obsession with Sarah's case shaped every decision Michael made about his future. He'd planned to move to Denver after graduation and study automotive repair, but instead he stayed on the reservation to be near his grandmother and to maintain pressure on investigators. He took a job at the tribal office, partly because it gave him access to legal resources, and partly because he hoped to develop relationships with law enforcement officials who might help keep Sarah's case active. The first few anniversaries of Sarah's death brought promises from various agencies that the case remained a priority. But Michael learned to read between the lines of official statements. New leads were rarely as promising as they initially seemed, and witness interviews that generated initial excitement often led nowhere. By 1995, Michael realized that if anyone was going to find Sarah's killer, it would have to be someone who cared more about her than about jurisdictional boundaries or case clearance rates. He began conducting his own investigation, driving to Riverton every few months to ask questions at the truck stop and surrounding businesses. Linda Hoffman, the waitress who had served Sarah that final night, became a reluctant ally, sharing details with Michael that hadn't made it into official reports. Linda mentioned other young women who had been approached by strangers at the truck stop, incidents that seemed minor at the time but took on sinister significance in retrospect. Michael's bedroom in his grandmother's house became an informal command center for Sarah's case. The walls were covered with maps, marking locations mentioned in witness statements, timelines of Sarah's final day, and photographs of evidence that he'd obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. His girlfriends never lasted long. Few could compete with a ghost for Michael's attention, and fewer still could understand why he couldn't let go of something that had happened so long ago. Eleanor worried about her grandson's consuming grief, but she also understood it. In traditional Arapaho belief, unresolved deaths trapped spirits between worlds, unable to find peace until justice was achieved. Michael wasn't just seeking answers for himself. He was trying to free his sister's spirit from the limbo of an unsolved murder. The silence that settled over the Wind River Reservation in the months following Sarah's death was different from the natural quiet of winter nights or the respectful hush that followed tragedy. This was a calculated silence, born from generations of mistrust and reinforced by whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when outsiders approached. Community members who might have held crucial information retreated into protective circles, sharing their fears only with family members they trusted completely. Mary Blackhorse, Sarah's closest friend since childhood, knew more about Sarah's final weeks than she had told any investigator. The two young women had worked together at the Tribal Cultural Center, and Sarah had confided about receiving strange phone calls in the weeks before her death. Someone had been asking questions about her schedule, claiming to be offering her a job opportunity in Casper. The calls came at odd hours, and Sarah had mentioned feeling watched when she walked alone after dark. But when FBI agents interviewed Mary, she offered only basic information about Sarah's character and habits, never mentioning the phone calls or Sarah's growing unease. The reasons for Mary's silence were complex and deeply rooted in reservation history. Her grandfather had been taken to a boarding school as a child, where speaking Arapaho resulted in beatings and where trust in outside authority had been systematically destroyed. Her father had watched federal agents arrest tribal members on questionable charges throughout the 1970s, and her own experiences with law enforcement had been marked by condescension and cultural insensitivity. When the FBI agents questioned her about Sarah, they mispronounced her name, showed no understanding of tribal customs, and treated her traditional beliefs as folklore rather than genuine spiritual practice. Other community members harbored their own fragments of potentially crucial information. Gas station attendant Robert Quinn had noticed a man with Colorado plates asking directions to the truck stop 2 days before Sarah disappeared. But the man's aggressive demeanor when questioned about his business had made Robert reluctant to engage further. The stranger had seemed agitated when Robert couldn't provide specific information about local college students who worked in town, and something about the interaction had felt predatory enough that Robert had mentioned it to his wife, but no one else. Traditional elder Dorothy Burns had experienced a vision about Sarah's death that she interpreted as a warning about someone from outside the community, but she knew that sharing spiritual insights with federal investigators would result in dismissal, or worse, mockery. The FBI's inability to respect tribal spiritual practices had been demonstrated repeatedly during the investigation, with agents interrupting traditional ceremonies and questioning the validity of cultural rituals that might have provided context for Sarah's state of mind. The most damaging silence came from teenage witnesses who had seen Sarah at various locations in her final weeks, but were terrified of becoming involved with law enforcement. 16-year-old Jessica Laurent had been working at a convenience store in Riverton when she overheard Sarah talking on a payphone about meeting someone who claimed to have connections to job opportunities in the oil industry. Sarah had seemed excited but also nervous, checking over her shoulder repeatedly during the conversation. Jessica's own encounters with police had involved harassment about minor infractions, and her parents explicitly forbade her from volunteering information that might draw unwanted attention to their family. The cultural gap between investigators and the community became most apparent during attempts to understand Sarah's social connections. Federal agents approached relationships through a law enforcement lens, treating friends as potential suspects and family members as sources of evidence rather than grieving human beings. They failed to understand the extended kinship networks that defined reservation life, missing crucial relationships because they didn't match conventional definitions of friendship or dating. Community members also protected each other from scrutiny that might reveal unrelated illegal activities or personal secrets that had nothing to do with Sarah's death. Bootlegging, domestic disputes, and immigration status issues made many residents reluctant to invite any level of official attention, even when they genuinely wanted to help solve Sarah's murder. The investigation's heavy-handed approach to questioning witnesses created an adversarial atmosphere that reinforced the community's instinct to close ranks. Detective Robert Fraser's frustration crystallized into something approaching desperation by the summer of 1991. His case files had grown thick with dead-end leads, contradictory witness statements, and forensic results that raised more questions than they answered. The hair found on Sarah's jacket had been tested using the limited DNA technology available at the time, but the results were inconclusive, providing only basic genetic markers that weren't detailed enough for database comparison. Fraser had requested additional testing, but budget constraints and competing priorities meant that Sarah's evidence sat in laboratory queues for months at a time. The detective's investigation notebooks from that period revealed his growing understanding of how thoroughly the case had been compromised from its earliest hours. Crucial evidence had been contaminated by the jurisdictional confusion at the crime scene. The tire tracks near where Sarah's truck was found had been obliterated by searchers before proper casts could be made. Fingerprint evidence from the truck's interior was limited because Sarah's own prints, along with those of family members who had used the vehicle, obscured any foreign prints that might have belonged to her killer. Fraser's pursuit of the mysterious vehicle seen at the truck stop became an exercise in futility that consumed months of investigation time. The conflicting descriptions provided by witnesses made it impossible to narrow down vehicle type, color, or license plate information. Linda Hoffman's initial description of a dark sedan gradually shifted in subsequent interviews, influenced by leading questions from different investigators. By June, she was no longer certain about any details beyond the fact that Sarah had approached some kind of vehicle in the parking lot. The detectives' attempts to trace Sarah's phone calls proved equally frustrating. In 1990, detailed phone records required court orders that took weeks to obtain, and by the time Fraser received permission to examine Sarah's calling patterns, the trail had grown cold. The phone company's records showed several calls to her number from payphones in various locations, but without modern caller ID technology, identifying the source proved impossible. Fraser spent countless hours visiting every payphone location, hoping to find witnesses who might remember seeing someone making repeated calls, but the effort yielded nothing. Fraser's relationship with federal investigators deteriorated as the case stalled. The FBI's initial enthusiasm waned when early leads failed to produce results, and their attention shifted to more solvable cases that could improve clearance statistics. Local agents were reassigned to drug trafficking cases that generated more political pressure than a single homicide on reservation land. Fraser found himself increasingly isolated, working Sarah's case with minimal support and constantly fighting for resources that were being allocated elsewhere. The detective's personal investment in the case began taking a toll on his family life and professional relationships. His wife complained that he talked about Sarah constantly, bringing the case home in ways that made their dinner table conversations morbid and obsessive. His partner requested a different assignment, frustrated by Fraser's inability to accept that some cases simply couldn't be solved with available resources and technology. Fraser's supervisors suggested that he focus on newer cases with better prospects for resolution, but he couldn't abandon Sarah's investigation. By 1992, Fraser had exhausted every conventional investigative avenue. He had interviewed over 60 potential witnesses, followed up on dozens of tips that led nowhere, and pursued theories that ranged from random violence to organized crime connections. His evidence board covered an entire wall of his office, connected by red string that mapped relationships and timelines that never quite formed a coherent picture. The complexity of the display had become almost abstract art, representing thousands of hours of work that had failed to identify a single viable suspect. The detective's final active push on Sarah's case came in early 1993, when he convinced his department to fund a psychological profile from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The profile suggested that Sarah's killer was likely a white male between 25 and 45 years old, someone with enough familiarity with the area to navigate reservation roads, but not enough local connections to be immediately identified by the community. The profile provided no actionable leads, serving mainly to confirm what Fraser had already suspected about the perpetrator's general characteristics. Detective Amanda Walsh stood in the sterile environment of the Wyoming State Crime Lab, watching forensic analyst Dr. Jennifer Romano extract DNA from the single hair that had clung to Sarah Crowfeather's jacket for 34 years. The advanced STR analysis equipment hummed quietly in the background, its sophisticated machinery representing technological evolution that had transformed criminal investigation since 1990. What had once been impossible was now routine, though the weight of expectation made this particular test feel anything but ordinary. The hair measured barely 3 inches in length, dark brown with a slight wave that suggested Native American ancestry. Under high-powered magnification, Dr. Romano could see that the root was intact, containing the cellular material necessary for DNA extraction. The hair had been preserved in the evidence bag's controlled environment, protected from the degradation that had claimed so many potential clues from Sarah's case. Fraser's original crime scene technician had been more thorough than anyone realized, carefully documenting and preserving evidence that seemed insignificant at the time. Dr. Romano explained the process to Walsh as she worked, her hands steady despite the importance of what she was attempting. The STR analysis would examine specific locations on the DNA strand called short tandem repeats, creating a genetic fingerprint unique to whoever had left the hair. The technology could work with samples containing as few as 50 cells, a dramatic improvement over the DNA testing available in 1990, which had required blood or semen samples and even then produced results that were often inconclusive. The extraction process took 6 hours, during which Walsh found herself pacing the laboratory's corridors and checking her phone obsessively. She had called Michael Crowfeather the previous day to inform him about the new testing, and his voice had carried hope tempered by decades of disappointment. Michael was now 51 years old, his grandmother Eleanor having passed away 5 years earlier without ever learning who had killed her granddaughter. The burden of seeking justice had fallen entirely to him, and Walsh could hear the weight of that responsibility in every conversation they shared. As Dr. Romano prepared the DNA sample for analysis, she discovered something unexpected. The hair contained not just nuclear DNA from the root, but also mitochondrial DNA preserved in the shaft itself. This dual genetic signature would provide 2 independent sources of identification, significantly increasing the reliability of any potential match. The mitochondrial DNA, inherited maternally, could potentially link the hair to an entire family line, while the nuclear DNA would identify the specific individual. The laboratory's CODIS terminal displayed a green light, indicating that the system was ready to receive the new genetic profile. CODIS, the combined DNA index system, had grown exponentially since its creation in the 1990s, now containing millions of profiles from convicted offenders, crime scenes, and missing persons. The database had solved thousands of cold cases through both direct matches and familial searches that could identify suspects through their relatives' DNA. Walsh watched the computer screen as Dr. Romano uploaded Sarah's genetic evidence, officially designated as Wyoming Cold Case 1990-127A. The profile would be compared against every entry in the national database, a process that could take anywhere from minutes to hours, depending on system traffic. While they waited, Dr. Romano pulled up the original forensic reports from Sarah's case, noting the primitive testing methods that had been available 3 decades earlier. The breakthrough moment came at 4:17 in the afternoon. Dr. Romano's computer chimed softly, indicating that the CODIS search had completed its analysis. Walsh leaned forward as the scientist opened the results file, her heart rate accelerating despite her years of experience with cold case investigations. The screen displayed a single line of text that would change everything about Sarah Crowfeather's case. 1 potential familial match identified. The DNA profile from Sarah's jacket didn't match any convicted offender in the database, but it showed significant genetic similarities to someone whose DNA was on file. The familial search algorithm had identified a profile that shared enough genetic markers to suggest a close biological relationship, possibly a sibling, parent, or child of whoever had left the hair on Sarah's jacket. The familial DNA match belonged to Thomas Weber, a 43-year-old construction worker from Denver who had been arrested for domestic violence in 2018. His DNA profile had been entered into CODIS following his conviction, where it had remained dormant until Dr. Romano's analysis triggered the familial search algorithm. Weber's genetic profile suggested that whoever had left the hair on Sarah's jacket was likely his brother, father, or adult child, relationships close enough to share significant DNA markers, but distinct enough to rule out Weber himself as the source. Detective Walsh spent the following morning researching Thomas Weber's family history, diving into public records that revealed a complicated web of relationships spanning multiple states. Weber had been born in Colorado, but raised in Utah after his parents' divorce when he was 8 years old. His father, David Weber, had worked in the oil industry throughout the 1980s and 1990s, a career that required frequent relocation and brought him into contact with the kind of transient communities that surrounded energy extraction sites. The breakthrough came when Walsh discovered that David Weber had worked for Texaco as the equipment operator from 1987 to 1994, a period that included significant time in Wyoming. Company employment records, obtained through a carefully worded subpoena, showed that Weber had been stationed at various drilling sites throughout the state during 1990, including several locations within 100 miles of the Wind River Reservation. His work schedule had included regular trips to supply depots and equipment rental facilities, travel that would have brought him through Riverton on multiple occasions. Walsh's excitement was tempered by the realization that David Weber had died in a construction accident in 2003, 13 years earlier. The potential perpetrator had taken his secrets to the grave, apparently without ever being questioned about Sarah Crowfeather's murder. The investigation that might have ended with Weber's arrest in 1991 would now require building a circumstantial case against a dead man, a frustrating conclusion that offered answers without the possibility of justice. Further investigation into Weber's background revealed disturbing patterns that aligned with the FBI's original psychological profile. Weber had been arrested twice for soliciting prostitutes in different states, incidents that suggested a predatory attitude toward vulnerable women. His employment records showed unexplained gaps that coincided with police investigations of sexual assaults in Colorado and Utah, though he had never been charged with violent crimes. The picture that emerged was of a man who used his transient lifestyle to avoid scrutiny while targeting women he perceived as powerless. The connection to Sarah became clearer as Walsh traced Weber's movements through the winter of 1990. Texaco records indicated that he had been working at a drilling site near Riverton throughout December, housed in temporary worker housing that put him within miles of the truck stop where Sarah was last seen alive. His work schedule included regular evening shifts that would have ended around the time Sarah arrived for her mysterious meeting. The timeline fitted perfectly with the window of opportunity for Sarah's abduction. Walsh contacted retired Detective Fraser, now 72 years old and living in Florida, to share the breakthrough with the man who had devoted years of his life to seeking Sarah's killer. Fraser's voice cracked with emotion as he listened to Walsh's explanation of the DNA evidence and Weber's connection to the case. The retired detective admitted that Weber's name had never appeared in any of the original investigation files, a reminder of how easily the real perpetrator had slipped through the cracks of the jurisdictional chaos that had plagued the case. The most heartbreaking aspect of the discovery was how close investigators had come to identifying Weber during the original investigation. Fraser's files contained a report about questioning oil field workers in the Riverton area, but Weber's name appeared only on a list of employees who had been out of town during the initial canvass. A simple clerical error in the work schedule had placed Weber at a different job site during the crucial time period, eliminating him from consideration before he could be interviewed. If you found yourself drawn into Sarah's story, wondering about the justice that remained elusive for so many years, you're not alone. Subscribe to follow more forgotten cases like this one, and share your thoughts about how many other families might still be waiting for answers that advanced forensic science could finally provide. Detective Walsh found Thomas Weber at a construction site in Aurora, Colorado, where he was operating a crane for a high-rise apartment complex. The morning air was sharp, with the scent of concrete dust and diesel exhaust, as she watched him guide steel beams into position with practiced precision. Weber was a large man in his early 40s, his weathered hands and sun-damaged skin speaking to decades of outdoor labor. When Walsh approached him during his lunch break, showing her badge and asking if they could talk privately, Weber's expression shifted from casual interest to guarded wariness in the span of a heartbeat. They sat in Weber's pickup truck in the construction site parking lot, the windows fogged with their breath as Walsh explained why she had driven 3 hours from Wyoming to find him. Weber listened silently as she described the DNA evidence linking his family to Sarah Crowfeather's murder, his calloused fingers drumming nervously against the steering wheel. When Walsh mentioned his father's name in connection with the case, Weber's composure cracked, and she watched 34 years of buried suspicion surface in his eyes. Weber had been 22 years old when his father died in the construction accident, and their relationship had been complicated by David Weber's drinking and frequent absences for work. Thomas admitted that he had always harbored dark suspicions about his father's behavior around women, memories of inappropriate comments and disturbing jokes that had made him uncomfortable even as a teenager. There had been incidents during Thomas's childhood that he had tried to forget, times when his father had returned from work trips, agitated and aggressive, taking out his frustrations on whoever was available. The most damaging revelation came when Thomas described his father's reaction to news coverage of Sarah's murder in early 1991. David Weber had followed the case obsessively, clipping newspaper articles and watching every television report about the investigation. When federal agents had canvassed oilfield workers in the Riverton area, David had seemed genuinely relieved when they crossed his name off their list without conducting an interview. Thomas remembered his father burning papers in their backyard fire pit around that time, claiming he was disposing of old work documents. But the intensity of the fire and his father's secretive behavior had struck Thomas as unusual. Weber's voice grew quieter as he shared details about his father's possessions after the construction accident. While cleaning out David's apartment, Thomas had found a collection of newspaper clippings about unsolved murders involving young women across several western states. The clippings dated back to the mid-1980s and continued through the 1990s, suggesting a long-term fascination with violent crimes against women. Thomas had destroyed the collection, disturbed by what it might imply about his father's mental state, but the memory had haunted him for decades. The conversation took on an increasingly confessional tone as Thomas described his father's bizarre behavior in the months before his death. David Weber had become paranoid about law enforcement, constantly checking his rearview mirror and avoiding certain routes through town. He had spoken frequently about cold cases being reopened with new technology, showing a knowledge of forensic advances that seemed inappropriate for someone with no criminal justice background. Thomas had attributed his father's paranoia to alcoholism and workplace stress, but in retrospect, the behavior suggested guilty knowledge about crimes that were being investigated. Walsh pressed Thomas for specific details about his father's whereabouts during December 1990, and the information he provided corroborated the employment records she had already obtained. David Weber had indeed been working near Riverton during the period when Sarah disappeared, and Thomas remembered his father returning from that assignment in an agitated state that had lasted for weeks. David had complained about federal agents asking questions at work sites, and he had expressed particular animosity toward Native American activists who were demanding better investigation of crimes on tribal lands. The most chilling detail emerged when Thomas described finding his father's truck after the construction accident. Hidden beneath the spare tire was a small wooden box containing jewelry and personal items that clearly belonged to different women. Thomas had turned the box over to police as part of his father's estate, but the items had never been connected to any criminal investigation. Walsh realized that these could be trophies from other victims, evidence of a pattern of violence that had extended far beyond Sarah's murder. As their conversation concluded, Thomas Weber broke down completely, sobbing as he admitted that he had suspected his father's involvement in serious crimes for decades, but had been too afraid to come forward. The guilt of potentially enabling his father's escape from justice had eaten away at him, contributing to his own legal troubles and addiction issues. Walsh could see that Thomas was as much a victim of David Weber's crimes as anyone else, carrying the burden of terrible knowledge without any way to seek closure or redemption. The news of David Weber's identification as Sarah's killer reached the Wind River Reservation on a cold March morning that felt eerily similar to the December day when Sarah had disappeared 34 years earlier. Michael Crowfeather received the call from Detective Walsh while he was sitting in his grandmother's kitchen, the same room where he had waited for Sarah to come home that final night. The irony wasn't lost on him that the call came exactly 34 years and 3 months after his sister's death, as if Sarah's spirit had been waiting for this precise moment to finally find peace. The tribal council convened an emergency meeting to discuss the implications of Weber's identification and what it meant for other unsolved cases involving Native women. Elder Dorothy Burns, now in her 80s, spoke about the spiritual significance of finally naming Sarah's killer, explaining that in traditional Arapaho belief, the unresolved murder had kept Sarah's spirit trapped between worlds. The DNA evidence represented more than scientific proof. It was a form of spiritual liberation that would allow Sarah to complete her journey to the afterlife. Michael's reaction to the news was more complex than he had anticipated. The relief of finally having answers was overshadowed by frustration that David Weber had died without facing justice for his crimes. There would be no trial, no opportunity for the community to hear the full truth about what had happened to Sarah, and no chance for Weber to account for other potential victims whose cases might never be solved. The closure that Michael had sought for decades felt incomplete, more like the end of a chapter than the resolution of the entire story. Detective Walsh's investigation had expanded beyond Sarah's case to examine Weber's potential involvement in other unsolved murders across the western states where he had worked. The jewelry and personal items found in his truck after his death were being compared to evidence from cold cases dating back to the 1980s, and early results suggested that Sarah might have been one of many victims. The realization that Weber had operated as a serial killer for possibly decades added another layer of tragedy to Sarah's story, suggesting that earlier identification might have saved other lives. The media attention surrounding Weber's identification brought both positive and negative consequences for the reservation community. National news outlets descended on Wind River to cover the story, but their reporting often focused more on the sensational aspects of the case than on the broader issues affecting Native women. Michael found himself reluctantly thrust into a spokesperson role, trying to direct attention toward the systemic problems that had allowed Weber to operate undetected while crimes against Indigenous women received inadequate investigation. The most significant development came when federal authorities announced a comprehensive review of cold cases involving Native American women in areas where Weber had worked. The investigation revealed that at least 6 other murders shared similarities with Sarah's case, all involving young Native women who had disappeared after being approached by strangers offering employment opportunities. The pattern suggested that Weber had specifically targeted Indigenous women, knowing that crimes against them typically received less attention from law enforcement and media. Sarah's remains were ceremonially reburied according to traditional Arapaho customs, with Michael and other family members finally able to perform the rituals that had been interrupted by the original investigation. The ceremony took place at sunrise on a hill overlooking the reservation, with the entire community gathering to honor Sarah's memory and to acknowledge the long struggle for justice. Elder Burns offered prayers in the Arapaho language, asking the spirits to welcome Sarah home and to guide other families still seeking answers about missing loved ones. The case's resolution sparked broader conversations about jurisdictional issues that continued to complicate investigations of crimes on tribal lands. Sarah's murder had been solved despite, rather than because of, the bureaucratic obstacles that had hampered the original investigation. Reform advocates used Weber's identification to highlight the need for better coordination between federal, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies, arguing that Sarah's killer might have been caught decades earlier with more effective investigative protocols. For Michael Crowfeather, now 51 years old and grandfather to children who would grow up knowing their great-aunt's story, the end of the investigation marked the beginning of a different kind of mission. He established a foundation focused on supporting families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, using Sarah's case as an example of how persistence and advancing technology could eventually deliver answers. The Foundation's work ensured that Sarah's story would continue to serve a purpose beyond her individual case, helping other families navigate the complex process of seeking justice for their loved ones. As Michael stood at Sarah's grave following the reburial ceremony, watching the sun rise over the mountains that had witnessed his sister's final hours, he felt a peace that had eluded him for 34 years. The questions that had consumed his adult life had finally been answered, and Sarah's spirit could rest. But the work of protecting other women, of ensuring that no family would endure the decades of uncertainty that his family had experienced, would continue. In that ongoing mission, Sarah's memory would live on, transformed from a symbol of unresolved trauma into a beacon of hope for justice, delayed but never denied.